Hello, Little Masters, and welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Westu Hall, my friends. I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the Man of the West, the Aragorn to my Éomer, Alan Sisto.
Welcome to Episode 7 of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Boy, I didn't thought we'd get this far, where we continue our journey through the Silmarillion with the last of the two prologue chapters, Valaquenta.
And we're still just getting started, aren't we?
Very much so.
This is Tolkien's account of the Valar and Maiar, according to the lore of the Eldar. That's his own subtitle for it. We met the Valar in Episode 5. They are, along with the Maiar, the Ainur who entered into the world near the end of Ainulindale, to be the life of the world and to shape and bring about the vision that they sang in the music and then beheld as a vision.
Indeed. Well, as we mentioned last time, this is one of those chapters that can be a little dry. There's not as much story or narrative. It's a list. It's a kind of who's who of the Valar and Maiar, complete with class valedictorian Manwë, class clown Tulkas, and the guy who's always at the principal's office, Melkor. But it is a fascinating cast of characters, and it's very important to get to know them, at least to get to know most of them, to understand what's to come. So we may spend a little more time discussing and a little less time reading today, but our goal is to give you a good solid introduction to the Valar and Maiar.
And don't be surprised if you see a familiar face or two along the way.
Spoiler alert.
Sorry. But, Alan, before we jump in, why don't we take a look at Barlaman's bag and see if we have any questions or feedback?
I think that's a great idea. What do we have?
All right, so we've actually got one here from our listener, Nakat, from halfway around the world in Pakistan.
I love that our podcast goes that far.
Isn't that cool? Isn't it? Yeah, there's just such a great global community of Tolkien fans that
really is.
We've been able to connect with, which has been awesome. Nakat wrote in with a couple of questions. I want to save her second question for a later episode, because I think we're going to see an answer early in the Silmarillion. But I want to touch on her first question because it's in regards to one of our points from the Ainulindale episode.
Oh, okay, great. What do we have?
So she asks, Gandalf calls to the secret fire. And this is a reference to Gandalf at the Bridge of Khazad-dûm.
Right.
Yep, in Fellowship of the Ring, where he's facing off against the Balrog. And he says,
I am a servant of the secret fire, a wielder of the flame of Anor, yes.
Are there any of us who don't have that memorized?
Isn't that in Sir Ian McKellen's delivery, I might add.
Yes, indeed, yep. So Nakat says, if the secret fire is only candles from the flame imperishable, as we put it, why did he not say, I am a servant of the flame imperishable? Why is he just a servant of a subset of the flame imperishable? And if that is the case, which subset was it? Was it one of the Valar?
Well, that's an interesting question.
What do you think?
Well, it might be that our illustration with candles was a little bit, it wasn't a perfect analogy.
But
I think the distinction that needs to be made here is that the flame imperishable is the source of creative power. It is the source of creation itself. It resides in Iluvatar. It cannot be found elsewhere. It is distinct. It is the source. Whereas the secret fire, it seems to me, is the thing that indicates it is a created object. It is a created thing with life. That life may not be sentience. It may still be maybe the planet itself. It may be an animal or even a plant for some things. But the idea is that it is then invested with the secret fire.
So the secret fire is like the flame of life. The flame imperishable is sort of the source of that. The match.
Exactly.
A very, very large match, I imagine.
Yeah.
That lights all those little flames of life.
Well, I almost want to try to get away from that match and candles analogy, because...
Yeah, we've already got in trouble with it once.
Yeah, it's not a bad one. It's just, I think it might be a little inaccurate only in the sense that really no matter how big your match is, if it lights another match, that match is going to look a lot like the first one. And the difference here is one is the source and one is the result. That's what we're talking about here. Flame imperishable is the source of creative power. The secret fire is the result of the use of creative power. I almost hesitate to go here, but I have to because I think it might be relevant. Again, going back to Tolkien's own personal worldview, he repeatedly told us, and in fact in the letter to Milton Waldman that's included in the second edition, he talks about this being a mythology that could be believed by someone who believed in the Trinity. And reading that is what made me think, well, this might be analogous to, but not perfectly analogous to, the Holy Spirit. For those familiar with the Christian concept of the Trinity, God has three facets or three aspects. It's still one God, but you've got God the Father, God the Son, or Jesus, and then the Holy Spirit, which indwells those who are believers. It's a bad analogy because in that theology, only Christians would have the Holy Spirit, and in this case, all the creation
all have it,
has the Holy Spirit, has the secret fire.
Right.
So it's kind of a weak analogy too, but I'm hoping that maybe those who are familiar with that worldview would say, "Oh, okay, I can see how that's different." If the flame imperishable is with God the Father, then the secret fire is the Holy Spirit that indwells those that He has created. So it's kind of if you look at the two of them combined, maybe you can get a more accurate picture. But at the end of the day, it's really Gandalf saying he's a servant of the secret fire. He could have said, "I'm a secret of the flame imperishable. I'm a servant of the secret." I'm sorry. Let me try that again. I am a servant of the flame imperishable, because in fact, all of them are servants of Iluvatar, right? I mean, even Manwë is a servant of Iluvatar.
Because they all have their source in the flame imperishable.
They're all created beings, right?
Right.
All of the Ainur, and that, as we will see, that includes Gandalf. I'd say spoiler alert, but it's in this week's episode.
Yeah.
But, from Manwë all the way down to Gandalf are all beings who were created from the very thought of Iluvatar.
So he's speaking more directly of the secret fire, the immediate secret fire of the universe, the creation that he serves.
Of Ea. He is a servant of Ea. His job, his role as one of the wizards, as one of the five, is to be a servant of the world, that is, of creation, of Ea. Specifically, in his case, of the men and elves and free peoples of the West in their fight against Sauron. So in that context, specifically, he is a servant of the secret fire. But because he's a servant of the secret fire, he's also a servant of the flame imperishable.
Ultimately, a servant.
Right, ultimately. Because if you are if I'm a servant of A and A is a servant of X, then I'm also a servant of X indirectly.
Right.
And that's really what this is here. So there is a distinction, but he could have said the other way and it would have been just as accurate. So
right. Yeah. Well, keeps it immediate, and as you said, he's here on Earth. He's serving Earth, and so it makes sense that he would call back to that most immediate.
Absolutely,
the flames in question. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that was a good question, Nakat. That was, and I actually look forward to your other ones. You had another one that was really good that we're looking forward to in a couple weeks.
Definitely,
or a couple episodes, I should say. And for the rest of you listeners, we do have some more great questions to come. For those of you who have written into us, if we haven't responded yet, do know that we have your comments here. We have a nice little spreadsheet all laid out with our comments and thoughts and what we're going to do when we answer it.
It's a bag, Alan. It's not a spreadsheet. It's Barliman's bag.
Did I say spreadsheet? It's Barliman's spreadsheet. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I've just
when worlds collide.
Yes. But anyway, we have your comments here. Barliman has not forgotten the mail.
That's right.
We just had this Caradhras-sized avalanche, or it might be more accurate to say Weathertop-sized avalanche of mail from our first couple of episodes. I think we'll find some answers in the early Silmarillion chapters. There's some questions about the gift of Iluvatar to men. There's questions about the Ents and the Eagles. All of those are going to be answered just in these first, few chapters, for instance. So we'll get to those soon. Others are, frankly, just hard, and we're lazy. So we'll get to them when we can.
we're trying to give them adequate thought.
There you go. Yeah, they've got to sit and stew for a while. But stay tuned, and we will get to them. I promise you that. So Barliman is delivered. And because Barliman's delivered, there's no need to curse the ale, please. We really like to keep it good here. So before we get started on the Valaquenta, there's one other thing, not really a question, but kind of, that one of our listeners brought up that we should talk about first, since it's right up at the front of the start of the chapter. So, Sean, what do you got on this one?
Yeah, so one of our listeners, Tanya, actually reached out to us on Facebook and mentioned that she was surprised that we didn't mention something in our Ainulindale chapter, which is pretty important. And it's
you mean the creation itself?
The creation itself. She says, I was surprised that you forgot to mention that the music of the Ainur created first music, and then it became a vision when Iluvatar gave the Ainur sight.
Right.
And then it was beheld as a vision, and then it was only when Iluvatar said Ea, which is a word you've already said now, Alan, literally means let these things be, And by saying that word Ea, that's actually what created the universe. So it wasn't actually the music. The music was just sort of a description of the universe, if
It
you
was
will.
like the music laid the blueprint.
Exactly, right. And then the
Iluvatar
vision was
snapped
sort
it
of
into being.
the vision was maybe, I don't know, like the animated schematic or something.
Yeah.
The reason we didn't mention it, Tanya, was simply because we had about 100 passages that we would have loved to include that we didn't have
Like
time
the
for.
entire chapter?
Yeah, we could have easily had a 3 or 4 hour episode on Ainulindale. But you're absolutely right. It's very important, and we should have mentioned it because, if nothing else, Ea, this word that Iluvatar says to bring the universe into creation, is actually the Elvish name for the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And it also sets up something that we need to talk about today.
Yeah.
It's convenient, actually. I think Tolkien probably knew that we were going to forget this because he writes a brief prologue to the Valaquenta that gives us a nice little opportunity to discuss it. So I'm going to read that right now.
Okay.
So one of the first or second paragraph, I believe it's the second paragraph of the Valaquenta, says, "Then those of the Ainur who desired it arose and entered into the world at the beginning of time. And it was their task to achieve it, and by their labors to fulfill the vision which they had seen. Long they labored in the regions of Ea, which are vast beyond the thought of elves and men, until in the time appointed was made Arda, the kingdom of earth. Then they put on the raiment of earth and descended into it and dwelt therein." So Ea, the universe, has been created at the beginning of time. It's, again, the Ainur have seen a vision of what history, well, the entire span of time in the universe could play out like, but they're entering in at the very beginning, and it's their job to create that vision, to make it, to shape Arda to match that vision.
Okay.
They don't always match it perfectly.
No.
A lot of times it's because of Melkor's interference. Oh, Melkor. But I think sometimes they also just don't really know what Iluvatar had in mind. Also,
not perfectly, no, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, even Manwë, who we'll find was closest to Iluvatar in that, still couldn't be perfectly on the same page. I would add that important right before this passage is this text, and this gives us a little bit more light on what Tanya's talking about. Therefore, Iluvatar gave to their vision being, and that's with a capital B, and set it amid the void, and the secret fire. And I'll note that it was not the flame imperishable, right? Remember our distinction. The secret fire was sent to burn at the heart of the world, and it was called Ea. So Ea is the world, but Arda is the earth. Now, that's not how we often think of things. We often think of the world and the earth. When somebody talks about the world, we're thinking about the earth. But the earth here is not the world. Instead, the world is the universe. It's all of creation. It's Ea. And the Valar labor in all of it. Now, that's helpful to think about because then we realize that Iluvatar is outside of the universe, outside of Ea, because all of Ea is a created thing. That means even the timeless halls and the other Ainu, or the other Ainur, are outside of creation. Only the Valar and Maiar who have come in are inside Ea. We should have probably pointed this out a little more clearly in the last episode because there are a number of references in that chapter to the world that make a lot more sense when you realize the world as all of creation and not merely the earth. So.
Right. So when we hear of Iluvatar being outside the world, it's not that he's in space; it's that he's beyond.
He's beyond the universe
creation
itself, beyond creation outside. Well, that's enough of that. I hope, Tanya, that gives us a little more insight. But let's get on to the Valar, the greatest of the spirits who entered into Ea and Arda.
Yes, let's do that. So they are called the Valar, which means the powers of Arda. Tolkien says that men have called them gods, but that elves have called them the Valar, the powers of Arda. He also says that their names among men are manifold. I think this is significant because they are not gods.
Right.
Men have called them gods throughout history. And remember, we talked about in Ainulindale, and you just mentioned a moment ago, Tolkien's legendarium is inherently monotheistic with Iluvatar as the one god. But by saying that men have called them gods and that their names have been manifold, he's, I think, very clearly implying to the reader that if you've ever heard of any sort of polytheistic mythological tradition that has existed throughout, whether it's the Greek gods or the Norse gods or whatever, you get this idea that this is the the reality.
This is the true story, and those are just reflections of that.
Those, right, sort of imperfect reflections of the true story. And so anytime
human memories that are imperfect and incorrect, whereas the elvish memories, well, they were firsthand, so they have more accurate information.
Right, exactly. So if you think that, well, maybe Manwë reminds you a little bit of Zeus or something like that, it's because in Tolkien's conception, it's because Zeus was based on Manwë.
Right.
Basically.
It's not B reminds you of A. It's A reminds you of B. He's based on
exactly.
B.
Yeah. So
that's a good point. That's a very
cool
good point.
thing, and I like the fact that shows up a lot in the Silmarillion. We'll see that. I'll point out a few of those along the way. There's a lot of those, like, this is the true story. You've heard a story like this, but this is the true story. But anyway, back to the Valar. So there are 14 of them.
Mm-hmm.
There would have been 15, but Melkor has lost his place, and we will still talk about Melkor today.
Yes, his name is not spoken upon the earth. That doesn't mean we won't talk about it.
Right. He has
another
name.
Nor does it mean he's not mentioned here in the book a few more times.
Right, many times. So, so there's 14 Valar that we will mostly talk about, but we'll also talk about the Maiar and the enemies, because those are all mentioned here.
And some of the Valar, I should say, we won't really talk much about. We'll come across some who we really almost never see again.
Right.
And it's fair to mention them, but really we're going to focus on about 7 of them, or 8 of them, if I'm not mistaken. So,
yeah. Well, we'll maybe try to name them all if we can.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think we'll touch on them as we go through. Yeah.
And who's related to who. There's
some really interesting relationships. In fact, that's one of the things that struck me the most when I was reading through this again, was just the nature of not only the spousal relationships. You start out with Manwë and Varda, but all the sibling relationships that there are.
Right.
And that even as we get at the very beginning, that Manwë was the brother of Melkor. Mm-hmm. That's that makes Thanksgivings really awkward now, I think.
There'll be a few awkward Thanksgivings in the family unit.
There are going to be a number of them. That is true. But it's fascinating. I mean, he certainly didn't need to create familial relationships between the Valar.
Right.
But he did. And it's because that's how Iluvatar imagined them. Mm-hmm. Though I have to wonder, Iluvatar conceived them, certainly the sibling sets, as being brethren or sisters. But you have to wonder about the marriages. We only get to see one later, right? When Tulkas comes down and marries
one actual wedding, right?
Right. We only see the one wedding. But certainly that's an act of choice. It was his decision to marry her, and her decision vice versa. So you have to wonder, we don't see that happen with Manwë and Varda or the others, but, that must have been a relationship that was not necessarily, from the beginning, Iluvatar imagined them this way.
Right.
Yeah, but he did certainly conceive of them as being brothers.
Right.
So
it's very interesting, and it's interesting that though there are husbands and wives, there are no children. I could speculate for hours on why that is the case. I'll spare everybody that.
Please.
But I do think it's significant. And, I think it has to do with the fact that they're all created by Iluvatar. But
I think so.
But anyway, why don't we jump right in and start talking about
we did kind of just start, didn't we? We started with the Manwë and Melkor. Sorry about that. Why don't you go ahead and tell me a little bit more about Manwë?
That's okay. Yeah, so Manwë is the first one we hear about. And we also met Manwë in the Ainulindale. Mm-hmm. He's the lord of the air, the sky, the wind, but he's also the king of the Valar, and thus he is the king of Arda. Tolkien says that he was appointed to be, in the fullness of time, the first of all kings, lord of the realm of Arda, and ruler of all that dwell therein.
Yeah.
There are a few times I think that he's actually referred to as King of Arda, or King of the West, I think, or Lord of the West comes up a few times.
Yeah. Well, certainly Lords of the West are the Valar. So yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
I like this little bit here that we find out he is dearest to Iluvatar, and that he understands most clearly his purposes. There's a closeness, that it would be amazing to be close to the God who created you, the one true, self-existent, eternal being, and to actually understand his will, to comprehend it. There's not much more to that than that. I don't know that I can flesh that out much more. I just really like that. And I have to wonder if that was maybe... Yeah, go ahead.
I'll add to that, that's actually directly contrasted to the fact that the mightiest of the Ainur was Melkor.
Yeah.
And so it is not might that makes you eligible to be king of the world. It is understanding of Iluvatar's plan and understanding of Iluvatar.
Well, and you have to wonder how much of this was some jealousy going on too, right? Is Melkor jealous because Manwë is closer to Iluvatar?
Absolutely. I think,
yeah.
I think there's a couple of moments of jealousy.
Oh yeah. Well, he certainly wants to be king,
Melkor
that's for sure.
Melkor is certainly full of jealousy.
Full of all sorts of stuff.
Throughout. But yeah, I think that there's a few things, a few very specific ways in which Melkor is jealous of Manwë. We know that Manwë is that all swift birds, strong of wing, he loves, and they come and go at his bidding.
Eagles.
The eagles are coming.
I love his surname, by the way. That just sounds awesome.
That's right, yes.
Manwë Sulimo.
Manwë Sulimo.
Oof, just things just roll off the tongue.
Yeah, beautiful.
Well, in this case,
as always, the languages are one of my favorite things about.
Just beautiful, isn't it?
I love the fact that the eagles come and go at his bidding. We've all seen eagles show up in Tolkien's work before, and some among us have asked the question, why did the eagles always show up at just the right moment? I think this is the answer, frankly.
I think it is. Yeah,
I think it's there. We see here that exactly. Yeah, the eagle's appearance is always a kind of intervention by the Valar, intervention by Manwë. The Valar,
which could almost be seen as intervention by Iluvatar to some extent, since he is the one who understands most clearly his purposes.
That is true. That is very true. We don't see them step in often, but they do when they need to. And the eagles are certainly one of the ways that they show up in Lord of the Rings. Not the only way.
No, definitely not the only way, but that's
definitely one of the ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love how, when he pairs up with Varda, coming into how the eagles are used. Later on, we see a specific line here that when Manwë there ascends his throne and looks forth, if Varda is beside him, he sees further than all other eyes, through mist and through darkness, and over the leagues of the sea.
I love that.
And of course, and then similarly, Varda hears more when Manwë is with her. That the two of them, when they're together, are stronger than they are when they're apart, which is another theme that we often see. But more importantly, that his use of the eagles corresponds directly, I think, to the fact that he can see so much that's going on. Even in, for example, the famous scene at the end of The Return of the King. Mount Doom is erupting. You've got all this volcanic ash. You've got the mountains of shadow around Mordor. But Manwë can see,
right.
He's got it. And he sends the eagles and takes care of matters.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, I think you segued nicely into Varda. So tell us exactly, why is it that Varda enables him to see through darkness?
Well, let's talk about that. One word, light.
Yep.
In fact, let's start at the very beginning of this paragraph here on just near to the top of page 26. She's described as the Lady of the Stars who knows all the regions of Ea. So not just Arda, but all of the universe. Too great is her beauty to be declared in the words of men or of elves. For the light of Iluvatar lives still in her face. Wow. I mean, the light of Iluvatar lives still in her face. So none of the other Valar have that particular characteristic, or at least not described as having it. And it makes me think, and I don't want to throw out spoilers, but a lot of folks are a little bit familiar with some of the other stories. It must have been for the Valar the way that it was for the Teleri in Doriath, when we're seeing that the light of Aman is in the face of Melian, who is the wife of the king of that realm. So just as they're able to get a glimmer of the light of Aman there in the darkness of Middle-earth, here the Valar themselves are able to still be reminded of the light of Iluvatar just by looking at Varda's face.
That's amazing.
And it's, but she absolutely, from the very beginning, just rejected Melkor. And because she is associated with light and he is associated with darkness, it is not a surprise that he absolutely hates her and fears her more than all others whom Eru has made.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's everybody.
Right. This does make me wonder, she rejected him. I often find myself wondering exactly what his proposition was.
Same thing.
And I wonder, we talked about, I'm pure speculation here, but we talked about the many ways in which Melkor is jealous of Manwë. And I part of me wonders if, maybe there was a weird cosmic love triangle at the beginning of time or before the beginning of time.
Well, certainly one that she rejected, but yeah, I mean, if it was an unrequited love.
Yes. Not a triangle. I guess a triangle isn't the right word, is it? But but yeah, she if Melkor really you know had an interest in, she's
Yeah.
light, and perhaps
Well, he
something of
wanted
his
light.
darkness was either attracted to it or wanted to bring it down with him.
He wanted light from the beginning. We'll see that when we get to the end of this chapter. There's a great passage that I'll be reading about Melkor, and I think we'll see this come back. This theme of a lust after light, and that probably would have been if we're looking at reading subtext here and seeing whether there was some inappropriate proposition, perhaps. It would have been more along the lines of lust than an unrequited love.
Right.
And it was a lust for that light. And she rejected him flat out from the beginning, always, consistently. So, yeah. And there's, we harken back to some of the things that Tolkien would have, of course, seen as being universal truths. Darkness hates light. Darkness fears light. Light does not fear darkness. Light is a thing of itself. Darkness is simply the absence of that.
The absence of light. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the same kind of thing. Evil is not a thing of its own. Evil is a twisting of the good. Anyway, we'll get into more of that later when we talk about evil and the nature of evil. But certainly with light and darkness, darkness is not a positive thing. It is simply an absence of a positive thing.
It is a
negation.
Not a negation. Well, yeah, I guess a negation. An absence. Yeah. I like
an
that.
absence. Yeah. Well, you could, if you negated the light, you'd have darkness, the same thing.
Right.
But the idea being it's not a thing of its own, except, as we'll see, with a particular spider. But we'll get to that.
Yes, we will. Oh, I can't wait for that. Another thing I do want to point out about Varda, she is also a couple of her other names.
Yes.
She is known as Elbereth.
Does that name sound familiar, Lord of the Rings fans who've never read the Silmarillion before?
And it should. And she's also known as Gilthoniel, which is a name you've heard in conjunction with Elbereth. Gilthoniel actually means the star kindler. So this goes back to the idea that, her light is, we'll get to this a little bit later. We'll talk a little bit more about seeing Varda create some stars. I think we see that she definitely creates the brightest stars in the sky and brings constellations together. I love that. I'm a fan of stargazing.
I love his description of all those constellations.
All the constellations.
We don't get to that for a while, but yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things that Tolkien says about her here in the Valaquenta is about the elves that they call upon her name out of the shadows of Middle-earth and uplift it in song at the rising of the stars. And as you were just alluding to, Alan, if you've read Lord of the Rings, you may recall that there is actually the song. The Elvish name for it is Elbereth Gilthoniel. It's actually rendered in English in that first chapter in Fellowship of the Ring, the first time it appears. But just a beautiful song that the elves sing when the stars arise, and it's beautiful. She's very sacred to the elves.
Very. She's like they said here. They hold her most in reverence and in love. That's it. Done and done. Yep. She's the one they look to.
Yeah. And if any of this reminds anybody of Tolkien's description of the birth of the stars as a mythical event in Mythopoeia, I'm right there with you. So
yes,
I just know that that's something that I've thought of too.
And we'll see more of that when the stars are created.
Yes.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Ulmo?
Ulmo. So he's the next one that we talk about. He might actually be my favorite out of this first group of the Valar. I know you have your favorite that we're getting to soon. But I really like Ulmo. He is the Lord of Waters. He rules over the sea. It does say that he is next in might to Manwë, and that they were close friends. But by the time the Valar settle down in their home in Valinor in the west, he doesn't really come around much. It's not that he's antisocial, in fact. It's kind of the opposite. It's just that he kept all Arda in thought, and he has no need of any resting place. We're going to see a bit more of this in chapter 1 of the Silmarillion proper, the Quenta Silmarillion. So I'll probably talk a little bit more about this when we get to that. But one of the things we know about Ulmo is that Ulmo loves both elves and men and never abandoned them, not even when they lay under the wrath of the Valar.
I love that because, we'll see that, and this is not really a spoiler because it's going to happen in like 4 years when we get to Unfinished Tales. But we see this played out in another story where he openly talks about that, where he's his role is to kind of disobey, if you will.
He does.
Yeah.
He does kind of. He sort of disobeys what the other Valar are doing.
Yes.
As opposed to disobeying, sort of Iluvatar's command.
Oh, no.
In fact, I think I dare say, I think you mentioned when we talked about Ainulindale that the sea being sort of evidence of Iluvatar.
Yes. The music of the sea.
And the music, yeah, right, the music of the sea. I think that though Manwë understands Iluvatar the best, I think there are times when Ulmo seems to be even more Iluvatar's agent in Arda.
I think so.
Yeah,
absolutely. And, in that particular moment with Tuor is definitely one of those moments.
Definitely, yeah.
I love
because
go ahead. I'm sorry.
There are times that the Valar are going to leave us to our own devices, and even when they do, Ulmo is usually there.
Yeah, he's the last one to abandon. He's the one who will always come alongside elves and men and help them when possible. So, I love the sound of the name of his horns. I've got to read this line that at times he will come unseen to the shores of Middle Earth, or pass far inland up firths of the sea, and there make music upon his great horns, the Ulumuri, that are wrought of white shell. And those to whom that music comes hear it ever after in their hearts, and longing for the sea never leaves them again. The Ulumuri.
It's such an incredible word.
It's a musical word in itself, isn't it?
It's a musical, and it's a liquid word to me.
It really
is. Just sounds like flowing water. It's beautiful.
It is. Again, just Tolkien's gift for language is phenomenal. And it's why all other fantasy authors seem to fall short. Really. I mean,
but they haven't spent their lives studying language the way he has. I'm sure some of them probably have, come close.
Well, of course.
Maybe some that I don't know of have come really close.
That may be. I'm not as well read as I should be. I'm sure I have not read all of them, but it's
this was Tolkien's passion, and it was very important to him. He was
like we saw in the biographical material that one time when his mother explained something about words, and he realized that it's the great green dragon, and why you have to say the great green dragon, not the green great dragon.
Right.
And he stopped writing stories for like 5 years.
I got to figure out
this
language thing before I can write more. Yeah.
And it's almost like he realized something. There's something that a lot of folks don't realize, and that is words mean things. Most folks do figure that out, but very few people take it as far as Tolkien, who seems to have taken it to words mean everything. And he really does kind of take words to their ultimate, and demonstrates that in his creation of language. It's pretty impressive stuff. But
yeah, there's one more thing I want to point out about Ulmo, and then I want to let you talk about Aule a little bit here. But but the last sentence about Ulmo. First of all, I should point out that Ulmo is not married. He is one of the two Valar who is not married.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's not what I'm going to talk about. But what I'm going to talk about is the last sentence about Ulmo.
The perpetual bachelor.
The last couple of sentences about Ulmo. It says, "For all seas, lakes, rivers, fountains, and springs are in his government, so that the elves say that the spirit of Ulmo runs in all the veins of the world. Thus news comes to Ulmo, even in the deeps, of all the needs and griefs of Arda, which otherwise would be hidden from Manwë."
So he can see far, but when he can't see through, let's say,
water,
maybe
the
mountains,
into the
he can't see through the mountain and down into the roots of the mountain. So, for instance, he might not have ever seen Gollum and the ring in the bottom of the Misty Mountains there, but news of that would have come to Ulmo.
Right, and I think that is one reason why Ulmo is able to and is willing to respond to the griefs of mankind.
That's true. He's responding from a position of being more well informed.
Right.
Yeah,
right, and we'll see that the Valar they're paying attention to what happens in Arda, but they also are living behind a fortress, a literal fortress of mountains. And
that's true.
And so Ulmo is, because he lives on the other side of that fortress, and lives in the sea. He's just a little bit more in tune with us. And I also love this reference to the needs and griefs of Arda, because we're going to talk about another Vala who is associated with grief, and who is also single.
Who's also single. You'd think the two of them would get together one of these days.
You'd think.
I mean, it's kind of a small market now.
I'm not sure if they'd be the most fun couple in the world, but
no, I don't think so. Talk about waterworks.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. That's Alan. I'm going to let you redeem yourself by talking about my favorite
Aule.
couple of the Valar.
So Aule, a little bit less powerful than Ulmo, right? He has might, little less than Ulmo. He's all about the earth and the substances of which earth is made. He was working very closely with Manwë and Ulmo. In fact, the three of them really were the guys who built the earth, if you want to put it that way. Mm-hmm. The fashioning of the lands was his labor. It says here, he is a smith and a master of all crafts, and he delights in works of skill, however small, as much as in the mighty building of old. So he's got the gems, he's got the gold, but his also are the walls of the mountains and the basins of the sea. Now, interesting, Melkor specifically is identified as being jealous of him because Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers. There was long strife. Melkor basically undid everything he did, and Aule just got sick and tired of having to go back and fix the problem. But this is the part that really jumps out at me because it brings back some of the things we talked about Melkor last episode. Both, in this case Aule and Melkor, also desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill. So here we're talking about some sort of sub-creative impulse. Mm-hmm. But here's the key. Aule remained faithful to Eru and submitted all that he did to his will. And he did not envy the works of others, but sought and gave counsel. So what do you see here? We see faithfulness, we see submission or humility, we see a lack of envy, and we see a willingness to both seek and give counsel, which we saw earlier is really indicative of wisdom.
It's sort of the opposite of, was it the four sins of Melkor that you identified in Ainulindale? It's really almost point for point opposites to those.
Yeah, it's very close to it. And then we see Melkor repeating himself, spent his spirit in envy and hate. And I think it's key that he spent his spirit. It indicates in that case that it's a finite thing to spend. And we do see that in fact we see it right here, that until at last he could make nothing save in mockery of the thought of others, and all their works he destroyed if he could. So again, we see the subcreative impulse and how it works out for good and how it can be perverted and twisted to evil. And that's something that we'll see again over and over again with Melkor, with him even after he becomes Morgoth.
Well, and I think it might be a later chapter. I might be thinking of chapter 2, where it talks a little bit more about why Aule creates and why he enjoys his work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we see that in chapter 2.
Yeah. So I won't spoil it because we'll get to it soon. But we do see here that Melkor wants to create to increase his own, really to increase his own status and increase his own power. And we saw that in the Ainulindale that
it's all about dominion.
It's all about dominion. It was all about just wanting to increase the part assigned to himself, I think is
Pride.
The word in the Ainulindale. Yep. And so that I think is one of the really big distinction between the two of them is really Aule is he just likes to subcreate, whereas Melkor wants to pervert things to his will.
To dominate, yeah. Well, I love Yavanna as well, but I know she's one of your favorites, so I'm going to let you take Yavanna.
Thank you. I do really enjoy Yavanna. She's Aule's wife. She's called the Giver of Fruits. Her elvish epithet is Kementari, which is another beautiful word.
Isn't that gorgeous? Yavanna Kementari.
And so she is, as her name would imply, the Giver of Fruits. She's sort of the life, especially plant life, not exclusively plant life, as we'll get to. But we see that she governs things from the trees like towers and forests long ago to the moss upon stones or the small and secret things in the mold. And I think that image of moss upon stones is no accident. I mean, really, does Tolkien ever use words accidentally? But I mean, this idea of moss upon stones, it shows her side by side with her husband Aule. And as I think many of the Valar married couples are complementary. We talked about Manwë and Varda being very, very complementary. They are so much stronger together. Yavanna and Aule are complementary to a point, but I mean,
there's a little conflict there too. We'll see that in chapter 2.
There's quite a bit of conflict there, and it kind of makes them sort of like the old bickering couple of the Valar, which I love. But I think that that's very important. Certainly. Break it down a little bit. Certainly plants need minerals to nourish them. But then there are times where barren stones and plant life may be at odds with each other. maybe thinking more philosophically, I don't want to get too allegorical here, but Aule represents technology and artifice to a degree.
To a degree, yeah, certainly craft, yeah.
Craft, and Yavanna representing, sort of the natural processes.
Pristine, yeah.
So there's some obvious conflicts there, I think. I don't want to talk too much about their relationship because again,
we'll get a whole chapter on that in just
chapter
like 2
two
more
is
episodes.
It's named after them, so we will see a good taste of their relationship.
Yeah.
I do want to talk a little bit about her domain though, because she governs all plants. She's particularly associated with trees. I believe it is in chapter 2 where she kind of mentions that trees are her favorite of all of her creations.
Right.
What's not entirely clear here is that she's not only associated with plant life, which the elves call Olvar, but she's also associated with animal life, which the elves call Kelvar. I think I got those two in the right order.
I think you did.
I hope I got those two in the right order. Sort of the elvish words for flora and fauna. But trees are definitely a big part of her identity, and so I love some of the language that Tolkien uses to describe her. Again, in chapter 2, she's very tree-like in the way she's described.
Mm-hmm. And here she's definitely described it as like a tree under heaven, crowned with the sun.
Is it there? Okay,
yeah.
And here I've windowed out my.
Right there at the very bottom of 27, top of 28, and the form of a woman, she's tall and robed in green.
There you go.
But at times she takes other shapes. Some there are who have seen her standing like a tree under heaven, crowned with the sun. And from all its branches there spilled a golden dew upon the barren earth, and it grew green with corn. And I love this line, but the roots of the trees were in the waters of Ulmo, and the winds of Manwë spoke in its leaves. Mm-hmm. Again, teamwork.
Yep. And I thank you for finding that. I had windowed out of my ebook.
That's all it takes.
Yeah. She's one of the ones that I love to see the way that she interplays with the other Valar. You got a little bit of it there with the roots being in the waters of Ulmo. You see
we'll
a bit
get more in chapter 2 for sure when she talks
absolutely
to Manwë.
And
Conversations with Aule.
Right. So just some foreshadowing of things to come. And if you want to read ahead to Aule and Yavanna, it's I won't blame you because it's one of my favorite chapters. I know it's one of yours, Alan.
Yeah, it absolutely is. The story of Aule is one of my favorite stories in all of the Legendarium.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we've covered the first 5 Valar now.
Mm-hmm. And now it's time to talk about the brothers, the
Yes.
Fanturi.
Yes, I do want to get into the Fanturi. You know I'm a big fan of the Fanturi.
Yeah, that's why I'm letting you take them too.
Thank you. I do want to. There's a neat little memory or mnemonic device that I've come up with because again we've got 14 Valar to get through, and they're sometimes hard to keep straight.
They are. They definitely. are.
I have hit upon a way to keep them straight in my mind. So maybe somebody listen.
I've got to hear this. What do we got?
We'll see. We'll see how well it works for you. But I think of them in 3 groups. The first group that we've just talked about are sort of the elemental Valar. They sort of govern. Certainly the male Valar we've talked about are very well aligned with elements, air, water, and earth.
Right.
No fire, because that would have been Melkor.
That clearly would have been Melkor.
But yes, the male Valar that remain good are those 3 elements. The ladies of the Valar that we've spoken about are more or less aligned to living things. So, as Aule is the earth, Yavanna is the things that live on earth. And as Manwë is air and the sky, Varda is, if you'll let me stretch this metaphor a little bit, she's sort of the living flame of the stars in the sky.
Okay, I can get that.
So again, those 5, this first group of Valar that we've just covered are think of those as sort of the elemental and physical world Valar. This next group that we're going to talk about is another group of 5, and these are all sort of associated with the soul and the spirit.
The Fëa.
And the Fëa, right? Fëa, the Elvish Quenya word for spirit. And the first ones that we will talk about are actually called the Fëanturi, the masters of spirits. So the first one of those is Namo Mandos. He is his given name is actually Namo. He's often called Mandos, which is technically the name of his home. The Halls of Mandos in the west of Valinor is where he lives. He is called the Doomsman of the Valar, and he is the Keeper of the Dead. So when we hear about Elvish heroes dying, we hear about them going to the Halls of Mandos. So there's definitely that sort of that death element. to him. But he's also the pronouncer of judgments, destiny. He's sort of the prophecy speaker of the Valar.
Mm-hmm.
Tolkien says, he forgets nothing, and he knows all things that shall be, save only those that lie still in the freedom of Iluvatar. He is the doomsman of the Valar, but he pronounces his dooms and his judgments only at the bidding of Manwë. So there again, we see, Valar working together.
Mm-hmm.
We see that Mandos is
in the correct order, submitting to Manwë first as the king, and then
exactly right. And so we get that Mandos has this this gift of prophecy for it's a clumsy word for it,
sure.
but he does it at the bidding of Manwë, and so his pronouncements do sort of have the force of Manwë's authority behind them.
Okay, so one thing though that jumped out at me was this notion of the doomsman. I think kind of our modern take on the word doom is always a bad thing.
Right.
But, I think if we look at, again, the etymology and looking back at the history of the word, coming back from Middle English, it's not always necessarily a horrible thing. It may often be that, but it's specifically a judgment or a decision. It's related to, you might think of the word deem, that when we deem something. So we're saying that I deem this to be such and such. To doom, or to pronounce a doom, is just to turn that verb deem into a noun. Right. So it's to make a judgment.
Okay.
It used to be, the word actually is related to another word that meant like law. It's simply a statement of what is. So it's,
okay.
It's, you were right to talk about it being, kind of a gift of prophecy. But it isn't necessarily always a negative doom in that sense.
And that's a very good distinction to make, because
there are a few other times where he uses words that we now have a different meaning for.
Yes,
and we need
absolutely.
to be careful when we stumble across those. That was just one of them.
Especially with this one, because doom is such a negative word these days in modern English, and and Tolkien uses it in a more
neutral
neutral sense. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, sorry to have interrupted. I know I kind of threw that in there.
Apologize for talking about etymology of a word. Yeah, you'll never have to do that.
Word nerds. Yes, things you'll never have to do.
But I love what I love about Namo-Mandos is he is one that we're going to see a lot of. We're about to start getting into some of the Valar that we're never going to see again. But Mandos is one.
Wife.
Yeah, his poor wife. I know, she's got a great introduction, which I'll get to. But Mandos has a lot of great moments in the Silmarillion. He's usually just sort of off to the side of the action, and he'll just sort of speak ominously and say things that no one understands until a little bit later, like
things of portent.
The first.
Yes.
Things like that. He'll actually, sometimes it's just a few words, sometimes it's a couple of paragraphs.
That's true.
And he's not exactly a fun guy, but I love rereading his passages, because I would say on second and third readings of the Silmarillion, I have a lot of fun reading his dooms that he's pronounced and thinking to myself, oh, that's what he meant.
Yes.
Because I know, since I've read through it, I know what's going to come. So he's a lot of fun. You're not going to understand a word out of his mouth the first time around.
He's very, that's a good way to put it.
He's sort of that classic, there's this kind of, trope from mythology of sort of the prophecy that you don't understand. I mean, he's very much the kind of the example of that in Tolkien's world.
Yeah.
But
he makes me think of, goodness. Sci-fi show, Babylon 5. Did you ever watch that?
I have watched it. Yes.
I cannot remember his name now. The alien that was in one of the suits that the captain would go and talk to. And
was it the Vorlon?
The Vorlon. Kosh. Yeah. He's kind of like Kosh. Nothing he says makes sense until like 3 seasons later.
Well,
thank you for remembering his name. I could not remember his name.
And we know that, that Tolkien was a huge influence on Babylon.
Oh yeah, 5. I was going to say we could get into that. I mean, Lorien alone just.
So that's Mandos. He's the words out of his mouth are not going to be a lot of fun, but once you get to know him, he's a very interesting character.
He certainly is. Fascinating.
His poor wife is Vaire the Weaver, and I don't think we see her again at all.
I don't know that we do. I don't know that we do.
But I love her introduction here in the Valaquenta, just because it's a really cool idea. So she's a weaver. Tolkien says that she weaves all things that have ever been in time into her storied webs, and the halls of Mandos that ever widen as the ages pass are clothed with them. Uh, I love that description. I think web, the use of the word web is kind of another one of those examples of, sort of an antiquated meaning. Web in this sense meaning just something that's been woven as opposed to,
right.
As opposed don't to imagine a spider web.
No.
Imagine something.
This is more like a tapestry. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I see Namo, Mandos, and Vaire as very complementary as well. You can almost sort of see Mandos as foretelling the future, and Vaire recording the past in these tapestries.
Yeah,
that's an imperfect. It's an oversimplification because yes, he also says that. I think he also says that Mandos forgets nothing.
Right.
So Mandos is thinking about the past as well. But I like to think of that interplay between those two.
Yeah.
It's just a really neat image. The idea of the halls of Mandos. Think of the halls of Mandos where the slain go.
Yeah.
And just
and
covered
while they're
with these
there,
tapestries,
they see the memories and the stories
all
of
these
all
memories,
the
the
time.
entire history of the world. It's beautiful.
That would be.
So
who's his brother?
His brother is Irmo, 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 and
Also known as?
like Namo, he is also known by the name of the place he lives.
Yeah.
So he lives not in a hall, but in a garden, the Garden of Lorien. So he is often called Lorien, or Irmo Lorien, or just simply Lorien.
Right.
I do want to point out, for people who are familiar with Lord of the Rings, the Gardens of Lorien are not Lothlorien.
No.
If you know Lothlorien, so Lothlorien in Lord of the Rings, which the forest where Galadriel and Celeborn have their realm, it is often called Lorien for short. That is actually a reference to the Gardens of Lorien.
Well, certainly.
Galadriel has walked in the Gardens of Lorien and so would remember it fondly. And so the name of that kingdom is sort of named after Lorien, but they are two very different places. Mm-hmm. Anytime we see Lorien mentioned in the Silmarillion, it will be the Lorien in Valinor, the Garden of Lorien.
Well, or the person of Irmo Lorien.
Or the person, right. You're right. Yep. So the Garden of Lorien is the Garden of Dreams. Irmo is the master of visions and dreams we see.
Okay.
Tolkien says his garden is the fairest of all places in the world and filled with many spirits. We don't see much of him in the story.
No, you're right. We see the place, not
we mostly
him.
see the place because, I'll get to the place is actually very important to all those who live in Arda. Mm-hmm. But there are references to his gardens as sort of a place of rest and inspiration.
Yeah, I love that. So, even the gods need rest.
Yeah. He does say, from the fountains of Irmo and Este, all those who dwell in Valinor draw refreshment, and often the Valar come themselves to Lorien, and there find repose and easing of the burden of Arda. So yeah, like you said, like even the Valar, even the gods need rest.
Yep. Because they're created beings. They're created beings, dependent.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, they're not truly gods. Running Arda is a tough job. And sometimes they need rest and refreshment, and they get it from
big job.
And they get it from Irmo and
his wife Este.
Este, right? Este the Gentle, who is sort of described as a healer of hurts and weariness, and sort of a giver of restoration, I guess you could say.
Yeah, definitely.
Unfortunately, another one that I don't think we see again.
Well, I think we might hear a little bit about her when Feanor's mother ends up tended in the gardens. I think, doesn't she tend? I may be wrong.
I think you're right.
I'd have to look that up, and that might be too far away to Google that. But
well, we may see her again. She's not too prominent.
Yeah, we wouldn't see her much more. And if we see her one more time, that would probably be about it.
Right.
But they have a sister.
They have a sister. I would say the fifth one of my group of soul Valar
is a really fascinating character.
Yeah, and I know she's one of your favorites. So
well, she is, and you know what? We actually talked about her in the last episode without talking about her. Nienna. She's the sister of Namo and Irmo. She dwells alone, so she, like Ulmo, lives by herself. She, in fact, lives near Mandos in the west of the west, on the very borders of the world. So she's at the opposite end of Aman from Valimar, from where the Valar live and where they gather the circle. But here's what Tolkien says about her. She is acquainted with grief and mourns for every wound that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor. And this is the line I really want to pay attention to. So great was her sorrow as the music unfolded, that her song turned to lamentation long before its end, and the sound of mourning was woven into the themes of the world before it began. Now, while we have that phrase fresh in our minds, let's go back to the bottom of page 16 in Ainulindale. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion. Now, we already know from looking at it later that Manwë was the chief instrument of the second theme. So here we get into the third theme. Who might this main instrument be? For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds and delicate melodies, but it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. And here's the third theme. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow, and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. An immeasurable sorrow from which its beauty chiefly came. And here we get, so great was her sorrow as the music unfolded, that her song turned to lamentation long before its end, and the sound of mourning was woven into the themes of the world before it began. I don't know that it can be a whole lot more obvious that Nienna was the chief instrument of the third theme.
I think you're right.
And that her sorrow, her lamentation, her weeping was a great part of what made that third theme beautiful. So again, this is sometimes that we see that bad becomes good, that something that hurts can still bring good. And that would be this.
And become beautiful.
Yeah, become absolutely beautiful. And it's key that this isn't self-pity. She's not crying because she's been hurt.
No, not at all. Right.
She's weeping for the world. She's weeping for like she talks about the wounds that Arda has suffered in the marring of Melkor.
It's the hurts of the world, isn't it?
Yeah. And those who listen to her learn pity and endurance in hope. Which, endurance and hope, does that describe Frodo and Sam in Return of the King or what?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's the learning hope from it, not despair from your sorrow.
Right. Like we talked about last time with hope and despair.
Right.
Or like we, on Tolkien Reading Day, when we talked about Denethor and Theoden.
Right.
How hope and despair are such opposites. And here you learn endurance in hope. So she lives west of west on the borders of the world. She doesn't come to Valamar where all is glad. She does not join the party very often. Instead, she goes to her brother's halls, Mandos, and all those who wait in Mandos cry to her, for this is the other thing she does. She brings strength to the spirit and turns sorrow to wisdom. So again, taking something bad, painful, and turning it into something good, wisdom. So,
I even love the next sentence of that, that the windows of her house look outward from the walls of the world.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit in the Tolkien Reading Day episode about the hope that lies beyond the walls of the world.
Yeah.
And that is very well wrapped up with Nienna, and I think it's very well wrapped up with the gift of Iluvatar.
It is. And it's interesting because, of course, they're bound, the Valar are, to the world. Their life is the world's, and the world's life is theirs. So that hope may not be there for her. I don't know. We don't know. We certainly don't know what will happen to those Valar or those Ainur who went down into Arda,
right,
or into Ea. But the hope is out there. The hope is way out there. It's outside of Ea altogether in the timeless halls with
Iluvatar. Beyond the universe. Yeah. Right.
And she knows it because she was there. The Valar were there.
I also love that when you read that passage from Ainulindale, there's the word deep is used to describe her music. We hinted at the fact that it's kind of a shame that Ulmo and Nienna never got together. As the two single Valar, they seem to have a lot in common. They both seem to be very well keyed into Iluvatar's plan in a way. They are.
They both care deeply for others, right?
They both care deeply for others. Yeah,
almost never given up.
They both are into the waterworks, as you said.
Lots and lots of crying. I get to see Ulmo would you stop crying, please, just for a minute? It's our wedding day, for crying out loud.
He wouldn't know because the tears would just flow out into the sea, wouldn't they?
That's true, yeah. That's why they would be a good match.
Yeah.
Well, there's really no easy segue from the gal who cries all the time to the party boy.
No,
so I'm not going to bother trying.
We're kind of going from the serious kids to the cool kids, aren't we?
Yeah, Tulkas here, man. He's like the high school quarterback. You know, he's all brawn and no brains. I love him.
Yeah.
Not that I was him. I was not. I was like you probably.
Oh, yes. It was quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. But let's take a look at him. Again, another surname that just rocks. Greatest in strength and deeds of prowess is Tulkas, who is surnamed Astaldo the Valiant.
Astaldo, what a great name!
It sounds just so amazingly powerful.
Yeah.
He came last to Arda to aid the Valar in the first battles with Melkor. Now he delights in wrestling and in contests of strength, and he rides no steed, for he can outrun all things that go on feet. And he's tireless.
Faster.
He is
faster than everything else that moves.
Horse.
Yeah.
He's like the Flash and the Hulk all in one.
Right.
But blonde. Yeah. But blonde
Yeah.
and probably good looking too, right? He gets all the cheerleaders.
You know he's well.
I mean, he's like a fraternity president and a high school quarterback, and he probably was prom king. He has little. This is the part I really like. He has little heed for either the past or the future. He's kind of like, what? I mean, he has no idea what happened.
Not
he
now,
doesn't
man.
really
I'm
care
fighting.
what's gonna happen. You know, he's more like, dude, is my hair all right?
Right, right.
Is my hair still golden? Is my flesh still ruddy? And is of no avail as a counselor.
No avail.
Don't go to him for advice.
Nope.
But he is a hearty friend.
Mm-hmm.
Of course he is. I mean, this is the guy who's the life of the party. And he marries the life of the party. His spouse is Nessa, who's Orome's sister. Those two must not have gotten along very well when they were kids. But she's lithe and fleet-footed. Deer she loves. They follow her train wherever she goes in the wild, or whenever she goes in the wild. But she can outrun them. She's quick, just like her husband. Mm-hmm. In dancing she delights, and she dances in Valamar on lawns of never-fading green. This is like the quintessential party couple.
Oh yeah, they are a fun couple.
Everybody wants to hang out with Tulkas and Nessa.
But if they want to get away, they'll run away fast.
Well, yeah, that's true. And please, just probably don't ask them for advice.
No,
but certainly not Tulkas. He's of no avail as a counselor. Is about as close as Tolkien gets to insulting any of the Valar.
That's true. It is kind of the one sort of backhanded little.
If I said that about somebody, is that a compliment?
Yeah, it's a good point.
Think so.
I don't think it really is.
No, but he is a hearty friend, and
he is a hearty friend, and he's kind of weapon number one.
Oh, he is
in the fight against Melkor.
Yes,
and
he is, and
Melkor
for good reason.
Hates Tulkas.
Oh, and Tulkas never trusts Melkor. I love. There's a scene later on where basically Tulkas just clenches his fist and just is like, he wants to say, Tulkas smash and go off on his rage. But that he's got to abide by the rules. We'll get to that line. That you know where I'm thinking, right?
I do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great piece of text, but we can't get to that yet. Again, Tulkas is awesome. So, but you talked about this third group, the kind of the sportsmen.
The sportsmen.
So introduce the other one to us.
The party group. Yeah. Well, I guess this next one isn't really.
Orome's not much of a partier. He's a sportsman, but not a partier.
He's a sportsman, but not a partier. So Orome, I love Orome.
Oh, I do too.
He's not as fun as Tulkas, but he's pretty cool. He's the hunter.
Yep.
So the introduction to him is this: Orome is a mighty lord. If he is less strong than Tulkas, he is more dreadful in anger. Whereas Tulkas laughs ever in sport or in war, and even in the face of Melkor, he laughed in battles before the elves were born. I love that part.
He just laughs all the time.
Laughing all the time. Orome loved the lands of Middle-earth, and he left them unwillingly and came last to Valhalla.
Unwillingly. That's awesome. We don't see that.
He would have just preferred to kind of roam around Middle-earth.
And he comes back a lot, so yeah.
He does come back a lot, and it's a good thing he does, as we will see eventually.
Oh, yes.
But, I mean, that's kind of his role. He's out there hunting. He's out there looking for the forces of evil and kind of cutting them down where he may.
Yeah.
And it does even say that. It says, often of old, he passed back east over the mountains and returned with his host. They Tulkas and Orome are kind of exact opposites in a way. You know, Tulkas is, like you said, Tulkas is jolly, Orome is serious.
Very.
You compare Tulkas to the Hulk, but Orome is the one that you wouldn't like him when he's angry.
That's true. That is true. He is more dreadful in anger. It's a good point. You've got I love that intro, but it's the rest of that paragraph that I love. I love this description of him, that he is a hunter of monsters and fell beasts, and he delights in horses and in hounds, and all trees he loves, for which reason he is called Alderon, and by the Sindar, Tauron, the Lord of Forests. But this part in particular is the part that I love, and you can tie this into the Rohirrim, if I'm not mistaken. Nahar is the name of his horse, white in the sun and shining silver at night. The Valaroma is the name of his great horn, the sound of which is like the upgoing of the sun in scarlet, or the sheer lightning cleaving the clouds. Wow. Again, Tolkien's way with words, just mind-bogglingly cool.
And it does remind you so much of the passage you read from Tolkien Reading Day about Theoden.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Not least just because that passage actually mentions Orome.
Well, yeah, there is that.
Tolkien actually specifically compares Theoden to Orome in that passage. And
in a passage where nobody knew who Orome was, right?
Yeah, I think you did mention that.
Here it is here. It's This is right after he's charging out, right? He said, ride now, ride to Gondor. And it says, Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the battle of the Valar when the world was young. Everybody's reading that the first time in 1954. I'm sorry, Return of the King, 1955. They're reading that and going, Ora who? Orome?
Who's Orome? Who's
Orome? I got to find out more about this Orome character.
Right.
Well, you're going to have to wait about 22 years.
Yeah. But it's interesting. You did say, we can tie this back to the Rohirrim. He does love horses, of course. The Rohirrim, we may have talked about this last time. The Rohirrim actually do revere him. They call him Bema.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of why I love Orome so much, because I'm the real life Lord of the Mark.
There you go. Well, and he's the only the only of the Valar who the Rohirrim have named, as far as we know, right?
I believe you are right. Yeah, that's the only one we see a Rohirric name for.
Yeah. Well, he's probably the only one they've ever encountered, or that their ancestors ever encountered, because of his tendency to come back over the mountains and into Middle Earth. True. Yeah.
And they even the story actually is even that the Meras, which are the royal breed of horses that Shadowfax, of course, is one of. There actually is a bit of Rohirric folklore that the Meras were descended from Orome's horse Nahar.
Well, that certainly sounds a little bit like Shadowfax, white in the sun and shining silver at night. Right, it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, I love Orome, and I could talk about him all day.
And we see Nahar come back. There's a moment when Nahar does something later that is one of the coolest little moments. You know where I'm we'll get there. I hate dropping all these pseudo spoiler hints. I do. I feel so bad, just teasing you.
Teasing everybody so much.
But there's a moment where the sparks from his hooves are very important.
Oh, that's right.
We'll just leave it at that.
Yes.
Right. So now you know where I was going.
Yeah, I was like, where is he going?
Where is that? I don't remember Nahar coming back.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, I guess I could let you tell us about Vanna, because we see her once in one sentence here, and that's about it. 2 sentences.
Not much to say about her. Vanna is Orome's wife.
Yep.
She is Yavanna's little sister.
Yep.
Not a whole lot said about her, and I think this is her one appearance.
This is her one appearance, yeah.
It's very sad. She is the ever young. She is the younger sister of Yavanna. All flowers spring as she passes, and open if she glances upon them, and all birds sing at her coming.
I just noticed she's listed as the younger sister of Yavanna. I don't think in any of the other sibling relationships there's mentioned an age. In Manwë and Melkor, they're described as coeval, so they have the same origin, so they'd almost be like twins, I guess.
Twins,
in that sense.
Yeah.
But none of the others are described as being older or younger. We don't know.
That's true. You're right.
If Irmo's older than Namo or is older than Nienna. We don't know.
That's true. Yeah,
if Orome is older than his sister Nessa.
Right.
I don't know. But it's mentioned here. But I guess when you say she's the ever young, she probably has to be the youngest.
Well, that's true. Yeah. And she's just, I don't know. She's like I wish we'd see more of her, because she just seems like a delightful spring.
All the flowers spring. I mean, how cool is that?
If Orome is so severe and so stern. Vana, I could just see Vana being sort of such a counterpoint to him.
Oh yeah,
It would have been a lovely relationship to get to see more of.
it would. That would be a fun little piece. Well, let's see.
So that's the 14.
That is, and really, there's 8 that you got to remember. And the good news is he actually identifies those 8 for you, doesn't he?
He does. He says these are the ones to pay attention to.
If you're going to remember names, folks, these are them.
Right. So the 8 that are the most important are called the Aratar, the high ones of Arda. And you can probably guess from the way we've been talking about them, but it's Manwë and Varda, Ulmo, Yavanna and Aule, Mandos, Nienna, and Orome.
Yep. And then we get to the Maiar, don't we? We get to spend just a little bit of time on the Maiar.
Yeah, we can talk about the Maiar.
Oh, my goodness. And we thought this was going to be a short chapter. I'm just looking at the length of the recording. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Folks, this is going to be a long run through the Silmarillion. Enjoy every minute of it, because there will be lots of minutes. So the Maiar, I think, we just real briefly that they are the same order as the Valar. They're just of less degree. It's an important distinction. Kind of hard to really quantify that. What does that mean, that they are of the same order but of less degree? They certainly have the same nature. They're both beings created from the thoughts of Iluvatar. It's just that the Valar are typically more powerful. But as we'll see, it's not always the case. In fact, there's one, Eonwe, who we see in the second paragraph here, is described as having whose might in arms is surpassed by none in Arda. None. So even Tulkas and Orome, who we just read about, would have a tough time against Eonwe. And he's merely a Maiar.
Merely a Maya.
Or a Maya, yeah. And singular and plural, let's get over that. Maya, Maiar, Vala, Valar, Ainu, Ainur. We could get into the feminine of it. I know that he talks about the Valier.
Yeah.
But we never hear the singular of that. And I don't even think we ever really hear them. I don't think we even hear that described as Valier again.
Right. So, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
But just let's make sure we get that right. Okay. So if somebody wants to send us in a comment saying you forgot to properly use the singular form of the, okay, we know it.
Maiar. Yep.
The Maiar.
It's hard though.
It is. But anyway, I just thought it was pretty cool that even Melkor, his might in arms, would not be surpassed by Eonwe.
Yeah.
But so tell us a little bit. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, Eonwe's one I really wish there was a lot more of in the Silmarillion.
I know. He gets some of the coolest lines, doesn't he?
He does. And one of my favorite lines in the entire Legendarium is spoken by
We
Eonwe.
have to wait a long time for that one. But yeah, I'm thinking of ones he says a little bit earlier. But yeah. He does get some of the best lines, period.
He is.
No doubt.
He is cool.
Tell us a little bit about the ones that work for Ulmo there. I want to hear a little bit about Osse and Uinen.
Yeah, so there's these two that are mentioned. Osse and Uinen are, Tolkien even says they are the best known to the children of Iluvatar. They're Maiar of the sea. Again, of the people of Ulmo, as you said. The best way to think of them is Osse is sort of the rough sea and Uinen is the calm sea, but they are married. So they sort of play against each other. If I may just read a quick passage here, we read of Osse that he does not go in the deeps, but loves the coasts and the isles, and rejoices in the winds of Manwë. For in storm he delights, and laughs amid the roaring of the waves.
So the breaking waves, rather than the high seas.
Right.
Okay.
Sort of that's true. The rough coastal storms. Seas. Yeah. And then, so his wife is Uinen, the lady of the seas, whose hair lies spread through all waters under sky. I could certainly go on.
Like seaweed? That's kind of what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, I think it could be. I mean, it does say that all creatures she loves that live in the salt streams and all weeds that grow there. So perhaps so. Yeah.
I don't know.
She's the one to whom mariners cry because she is the one who can calm the seas. And in fact, one of the things we see about the way Osse and Uinen work together is that, Osse is wild and unrestrained at times. True. In fact, Tolkien explains this by saying that Melkor actually, because he hated the sea, for he could not subdue it, he actually tried to win Ose over to his team, basically promising him Ulmo's job if he would
Help me get
serve
rid of
him.
Ulmo, and you'll
Right,
be
and
the
you
new
can have
Ulmo.
his domain. And so Ose actually started going a little crazy for a little while, and
Yeah.
that's where great tumults arose in the sea and started wreaking havoc on the land. And Aule just had enough of it and said, "Uinen, can you please do something with Ose?" And she actually did. Because she's this calming presence of the sea, she actually was able to restrain him and brought him before Ulmo, and he was pardoned and returned to his allegiance, to which he has remained faithful for the most part. For the delight in violence has never wholly departed from him. So
Wow.
there are still raging
storms.
seas there's storms at sea, and so mariners and those who dwell by the sea, they love Ose, but they do not trust him.
Yeah, I can see why.
Yeah.
The text briefly mentions Melian. I don't want to spend a lot of time on her because we're going to spend a lot of time on her later.
We're going to see a lot of her.
She's a Maya who served both Vanna and Este, so the wives of Orome and Irmo.
And Lorien.
Right.
Yep.
And in fact, she ends up spending most of her time in Lorien, as I recall, and
That's right.
something that we see when we get to meet her a little bit later. And that nightingales sang about her wherever she went, and that's also something we'll run into.
Foreshadowing.
But I want to get to Olorin, and I'm going to let you take over for a little bit.
Oh, Lauren, what to say about Olorin? I guess I would say this: if you don't know him yet, well, you do.
Well, you're about to.
If you know any of Tolkien's works, you already love Olorin.
Yes.
He is said to be the wisest of the Maiar. He also lived in Lorien when he lived in Valinor, but he also spent a lot of time learning pity and patience from Nienna.
From Nienna, yeah.
Which I think is very interesting. He doesn't show up much in the Silmarillion, and the reason for that is not because he wasn't there, but because the elves who recorded the Silmarillion didn't really know he was there. In fact, what is said is of Olorin, that tale does not speak. For though he loved the elves, he walked among them unseen, or in form as one of them. And they did not know whence came the fair visions, or the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. In later days he was the friend of all the children of Ilúvatar, and took pity on their sorrows. And those who listened to him awoke from despair, and put away the imaginations of darkness.
Awoke from despair. Well, I think that gives us a little clue. Just a couple days ago, we talked about, on Tolkien Reading Day, we talked about somebody awaking from despair by the name of Theoden.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a passage that I want to read. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Hold on. In on the window to the west in the Two Towers. This is Frodo and Faramir talking, and they were actually talking about Aragorn a little bit, and they were talking about Boromir and whether he believed Aragorn's claim. Faramir then says, "But I stray. We in the house of Denethor know much ancient lore by long tradition, and there are, moreover, in our treasuries many things preserved, books and tablets writ on withered parchments, yea, and on stone, and on leaves of silver and of gold in divers characters. Some none now can read, and for the rest few ever unlock them. I can read a little in them, for I have had teaching. It was these records that brought the Grey Pilgrim to us. I first saw him when I was a child, and he has been twice or thrice since then." "The Grey Pilgrim," said Frodo. "Had he a name?" "Mithrandir we called him in elf fashion," said Faramir, and he was content. "Many are my names in many countries," he said. "Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves. Olorin I was in my youth, in the west that is forgotten, in the south Incanus, in the north Gandalf, to the east I go not." So, ladies and gentlemen, when you read Olorin, but you didn't know who Olorin was, now you know. The rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say.
Yep. And it's just such an amazing,
isn't it?
Introduction.
It is so cool because that's when you start to see, look at what Nienna did, because he learned from Nienna the very characteristics that he needed to show when he came in the form of a wizard.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love that he's also associated with Lorien.
Yes.
This sort of idea of visions, and dreams, and
that's his job, really, is
restoration.
to give people hope.
To give counsel and to give hope. Yeah.
Good stuff.
It's beautiful.
I do. That's one of my. When I first read the Silmarillion, I knew that name, but I couldn't place it. And let's be honest, that probably happens to everybody because it's the only time that he is named as Aloran in the Lord of the Rings, is that scene with Faramir. And so if you don't happen to remember it, or if you haven't just read it recently, it just kind of rings a bell and you don't know why.
Like, that sounds very familiar, but it's...
But you read that description and, now it makes all sorts of sense.
Totally Gandalf, right?
Awoke from despair and put away the imaginations of darkness. I mean, there it is.
Yep.
So, well, and there's just enough time to talk a little bit about Of the Enemies, which is the last little section here. And the last of all is set the name of Melkor, he who arises in might. But that name he has forfeited. The elves eventually name him Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world. So it was he who arises in might, now the dark enemy of the world. Mm-hmm. And once again, we see some sins of Melkor. In the powers and knowledge of all the other Valar, he had part. We know that. We already knew that he had a little bit of all the gifts of all of them.
Right.
But he turned them to evil purposes and squandered his strength in violence and tyranny. For he coveted Arda and all that was in it, desiring the kingship of Manwë and dominion over the realms of his peers. Once again, more sin. Some of it's the same, right? I mean, it's the coveting, the jealousness that we saw earlier, the squandering of his strength. When you're given a great gift, you're expected to do something with it and not just squander it. And that alone is just wasteful, if not purely evil, of course. And then, of course, he turned those good powers into evil things. And this is, again, just another touch on how evil is good twisted. The powers that he had, the abilities that he had, were all good because they're the same ones that we see in all the other Valar. Right. He had a part in all their powers, but the powers aren't evil because they're doing them. They're using them for good. So the power itself is either a good thing or a neutral thing, however you want to look at it, and he's perverted and twisted it into a negative, into an evil. But it's this,
very sad. It's just very sad to think of it that way, Just this idea of this wasted gift. I mean, we talked about him as
what he would have been. What he would have been.
Well, yeah. I mean, we kind of talked about him, a little flippantly last time when kind of calling him a toddler and things like that. You think about it like this, and it is very, very deeply sad. It really is. Yeah.
Well, and you know what? And we see a little bit of that echoed in something that he does later, in the marring of Feanor.
Yes.
I think of the marring of Melkor, and sure, it was a self-marring, but it's still that same sort of tragic waste. That same sort of, here is this...
So much potential.
So much vast potential. And yet, as we see throughout Tolkien's works, that the more potential that there is, the more potential for fall there is.
Yeah.
The greater the fall when it comes. And that's a theme we'll see, sadly, over and over again. But there's one paragraph here that I think has to be read from start to finish, and it really does point out so much of what's wrong with Melkor. It's the very next paragraph, and I'm just going to read it uninterrupted. From splendor he fell through arrogance, to contempt for all things save himself, a spirit wasteful and pitiless. Understanding, he turned to subtlety in perverting to his own will all that he would use, until he became a liar without shame. He began with the desire of light, but when he could not possess it for himself alone, he descended through fire and wrath into a great burning, down into darkness. And darkness he used most in his evil works upon Arda, and filled it with fear for all living things. And that brings us back to what we talked about earlier with Varda. He had a desire of light, but he wanted to possess it for himself alone. Greed, possessiveness, all those things that we talked about before with the sins of Melkor.
Yep.
And then the descent into darkness, which then became his greatest tool.
And this idea that he's the reason we fear the dark. He filled the darkness with fear.
And we'll see even more of that in the chapter about the coming of men.
Yes.
Big time. There's a whole lot of that.
Yeah.
And how he uses that darkness later as the very fear to turn men against the Valar in the Akalabeth. So yeah, it is heartbreaking to see that kind of potential wasted, and to see how his evil ends up causing so many, many horrible things. And yet, I want to just bring it back to me. shall but prove mine instrument.
Yeah.
No matter what he does, he still ends up, even with those things, accomplishing the will of Iluvatar. It's a big picture thing. You end up having to see things
it is, yeah.
in a different perspective, and understanding it from the perspective of what would the realm of Gondor have looked like if the men of Numenor had never fallen. That kind of thing. And realizing just how Iluvatar ended up using some of the things that happened for good. So anyway, we'll get to that. It's big picture stuff. That's almost like end of the book discussion, isn't it?
Well, that's true. But that's the eucatastrophe. I mean, that's the essential optimism of Tolkien's worldview, and it's pretty powerful stuff.
It really is. Well, I know you've got a little bit here at the very wrapped up bit here on the Maiar that we're drawn to him.
Yeah, because he was not alone. He did, have this huge fall into darkness.
They never are.
No, they never are. And we've talked a lot about him. We have not talked about any of the others who fell with him. Tolkien says that for of the Maiar, many were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness, and remained in that allegiance down into his darkness. And others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. So some of them actually fell with him. Yeah. Some of the Maiar actually fell with him, and some actually were lured into his service afterwards.
I wonder if there's a distinction. I wonder if we can find a distinction between those two categories. Probably not.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think we would just have to speculate a whole lot.
Yeah.
I don't know. That would be a really interesting question. But I do want to talk a little bit about, the ones that we do hear about here. So the first group that we hear about are the spirits called the Valaraukar, the scourges of fire that in Middle-earth were called the Balrogs, demons of terror. So again, thank you, Nukhat, for the question you asked that allowed us to start with Gandalf and Balrogs and end with Gandalf and Balrogs.
Both of whom are Maiar.
Yeah, both of whom are Maiar. And there you see why Gandalf was the only one of the Fellowship who was able to contend with the Balrog.
Yeah, no, could have stood up. Yeah.
Not a
foe
chance.
Was beyond any of you.
And that's why Legolas, who I think is the only one besides Gandalf who knows what a Balrog is, or who recognizes it, I should say, when he sees it, he's terrified.
Rightly so.
The Balrog is a demon. Tolkien uses this word very specifically to say fallen angel, a demon. And so that's it's just something to be aware of. That is, we will see Balrogs a few times in the Silmarillion.
Oh yes,
because the world was, I think everybody was a bit more powerful in the First Age when the Silmarillion takes place. They're not quite as big a deal as they are in Lord of the Rings, but they're still a big deal. So don't mistake that. And then last, certainly not least, we have his most notable servant. And I just want to go ahead and read this passage, if I may.
Sure.
Among those of his servants that have names, the greatest was that spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or Gorthaur the Cruel. In his beginning he was of the Maiar of Aule, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In all the deeds of Melkor, the Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth, and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down into the void.
Wow.
Obviously, anybody who's read Lord of the Rings knows something of what Sauron's ultimate fate is.
Yeah.
So I don't think I have to talk too much about that, but I do think it's very interesting that we see that a few things about Sauron here. He was originally one of the Maiar of Aule.
Yep.
So remember that Aule was a smith and a craftsman. So perhaps now we understand Sauron's desire to make rings.
Mm-hmm.
It's also an interesting character detail because, I think we've talked a little bit about the idea that, that artifice and craft can be used for evil, as we see it happen with Sauron, and as Aule notably avoids doing.
Exactly.
But I also think that
we won't talk about Feanor and his crafting yet.
No, we will not yet, but we'll get there very soon.
Yes, we will.
But I just think this is we will see Sauron a few times in the Silmarillion. He's already terrifying when we see him in the Silmarillion.
Notably of Beren and Luthien. We'll see a great deal in that.
Yes, absolutely. And he's already a very powerful figure. The only thing that makes him less evil than Morgoth is the fact that he is following orders for the first part of his career.
A couple of ages.
But then we will see, once Sauron emerges as the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, he does really come into his own.
Yeah, he does so with vengeance. Let's just say
he does.
He steps into the role quite admirably.
He does, absolutely. But I think it's also just
Daddy would be proud.
If he wasn't so full of envy and hate that he
if he wasn't cast out into the void, but yeah.
Right. Oh, that too. But so here's Sauron. Here's your introduction to him.
Yeah.
Here's a little taste of why he is so terrifying to characters in the Third Age. And also just of note, let me kind of repeat the idea that as terrifying as Sauron is, as evil as Sauron is in Lord of the Rings, Morgoth, who is going to be our main antagonist through the Silmarillion, is I don't even know how many times worse.
Yeah, significantly. Let's put it that way.
Sauron is just a servant and a shadow of Morgoth.
Well, my goodness, that's the end of the chapter, but it's also the end of our time. That wraps it up for this episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Yes, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Be sure to come back in 2 weeks when we start with Chapter 1 of the Quenta Silmarillion of the Beginning of Days.
And as always, if you need cheap paperbacks to mark up, please use the links on our library page at theprancingponypodcast.com. I think it's like $35 for The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, and all three of the Lord of the Rings. Nice and cheap.
Great deal. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you take the time to submit a review, especially on iTunes.
Very helpful.
Those who have. Finally, take a moment to follow us on Facebook, The Prancing Pony Podcast. You can get current updates, listen to previous episodes, and if you really want to, interact directly with Alan and me.
You say that like it's a good thing.
Right. We're also on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod.
And one last thing. Don't forget to send your questions, comments, or 5,000-word essays on whether Balrogs have wings to the Prancing Pony... Okay, maybe not that one. To the Prancing Pony Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Prancing Pony Podcast at gmail.com. And we'll try to get them into our next episode or the next time it's appropriate. Well, an hour and a half or a little bit more is still far too short a time to spend among such admirable listeners. But until next time...
Farewell, friends.